All right, so in this one, I'm going to try to flesh out a thought I had when I was at the beach the other day. Not sure if it's an original thought or not, but it's basically a metaphor to try to maybe flex the idea of what thoughts are, what the mind is, and then what our role is or situation is in the thinking process. So what I'll do is I'll just briefly sketch out the theory. In the second step, I'll kind of use some visuals to try to map it out and flesh it out a little fuller. And then in the third part, I'll kind of just dance around in it and kind of freestyle and spitball some thoughts that come to mind. So in a nutshell, the metaphor is this, that mind is like the ocean, thoughts are like the swells moving toward the coastline. The mind is like the sandbar or the reef or the point that receives the swell and transforms it into a breaking wave. And then we, whatever we are, is basically a surfer or the act of surfing. In other words, something that can kind of see the wave, see its potential, and then ride it. In other words, transform what would just be a passing thought into an experience or an expression. So that in a nutshell is the concept. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of draw kind of a map of that process and kind of lay out, based on my experience of surfing and my understanding of it, kind of how waves come to the coastline. And in doing so, basically, I'm going to try to kind of elaborate and embellish upon this metaphor. Okay, so to start with a wave, we got to start out way out in the ocean. Right, there's a storm going. Right, maybe some lightning and some thunder. And the ocean, which may, an hour earlier have been perfectly calm, now starts getting whipped up, right? And so there's this energy that's getting pushed by the wind, right? And it's basically whipping up the sea and generating these kind of tubes of energy. And these tubes of energy roll through like a slow-moving wind in the water itself. And if you've ever seen, ships at sea that are kind of going up and down, what they're doing is they're essentially riding these waves of the swell. Now, these swells can travel for hours or days before they hit the coastline. Eventually, though, they arrive at the shore. And that's where they have the potential to become waves that break. And what folks who are familiar with the ocean, especially surfers, know is it's not like you can pick any point on the coastline and expect there to be rideable waves. There are points along the coastline, call them surf spots, call them breaks, where these swells can actually form a surfable wave. And so in my metaphor here, right, the whole ocean is mind. The swells are the thoughts. And then let's picture here a sandbar. Right, so this is the coastline right here, some trees on the shore, maybe some people sunbathing. And then out here, right, so this is the water. Kind of ring this all in blue here. Is some formation on the bottom. Right? It could be like a sandbar, right? It could be like a coral reef. It could be this point here, which may have some rocks dotted along the bottom. There's going to be some feature on the bottom that when these swells arrive as they approach, right, kind of lining up toward shore, moving in this direction, when they hit this bottom to form a breakable wave, essentially what the bottom does is it acts as kind of a ramp. The swell moves along the ramp, bunches up on itself, and then pitches forward, forming that surfable wave, right, which you can kind of visualize being like this. Right, the wave's breaking. It now has this face that the surfer can ride, right? Whereas if the swells didn't hit a formation like this, right, if they come here and it's just an uneven, right, unmodified bottom, nothing that's able to receive and shape the wave might come in and just crash all at once, right? We call that like a closeout. Or it may kind of just slide up to the shore and then slide back without ever breaking, right? And there's nothing there for the surfer to work with, so that's not a spot where the surfer would go. But if you can find that sandbar, that reef, or that point when the swells arrive at those, that's when they're able to develop that shape where they can pitch and the surfer can then ride it. Right, and so in this metaphor, right, mind is the sea, these swells are thoughts, and then this is the brain, right, the receiving, right, supportive structure that essentially transforms this raw potential of thought into a form that's experienceable by us, right, expressible by us, usable by us, rideable by us, right? And then we are this awareness, right? I think we often think we are either the mind or the brain, but we're really something else, this entity or this awareness that can experience the flow of these, right? Can feel thoughts kind of moving over the reef or the sandbar of the brain, right? Can notice them, some of them forming into coherent thoughts or ideas, some of them just kind of sweeping by. We weren't really sure what they were. And so that in a nutshell is essentially the concept. And I think the main benefit of using this metaphor or thinking of things this way is it kind of, I don't know, it kind of breaks the usual closed system model we have around thought, because I know when I typically think about thought and when I hear folks talk about thought, usually the idea is that it's all happening just in here, right? That inside that brain, right, or maybe in the gut brain or the heart brain, ideas are kind of bubbling up, right? Thoughts are forming out. And they're kind of rattling around in here. And the tempting idea here is that they're homegrown, right? That we're creating them, or that they belong to us, that they're our property, or that they're our obligation. And when we have this closed system model where we think, well, this is my body, my brain, my mind, my thoughts, it's really easy to develop, you know, kind of unhealthy attitudes toward them, attitudes that tend around pride and shame and things like that. I think if we think of it more this way, we can actually see that mind is something expansive and beyond the individual, right? There may be 10 surfers out in this lineup, right? All sitting on their boards, waiting for waves, right? They're all bobbing in that same sea of mind. They're all experiencing those same waves of thought come through. Sometimes this guy's riding a wave, sometimes this one's riding a wave, sometimes she's riding a wave. And so the idea is, instead of thinking of thoughts as something that only arise within an individual, right, that are something private, something exclusive, something possessed, some kind of commodity, instead see thoughts as kind of a common good, as a feature like a wave is, something that's available for all kinds of people to enjoy. And mind as being something, kind of a medium that we're all immersed in together, as opposed to being something that's contained within the skull. Likewise for the brain, right, it's easy to think of the brain as this kind of gizmo that generates thoughts, right, spits them out or spews them out, like my own little factory that I own, that I take care of or control. If instead we see the mind as really this feature of nature, and it's one of its main qualities, at least on the level of kind of cerebral experience, is being able to take these raw swells coming in, right, and shape them into these waves that we, the experiencer, can then surf. And so I just think that metaphor for mind, for thought, for thinking, and for then expressing or translating our thoughts into some kind of action, something shareable, something viewable to the outside world, is just a more inspiring and more interesting, and I think really more true to the nature of thoughts than that contained individualistic model. Okay, so that in a nutshell was the concept and kind of my fleshing out of it. What I want to do now is I jotted down a few kind of thoughts that I had around this that I'll kind of sprinkle in here. Let me see if I can find my notebook. There it is. Okay. So the first one is this notion of simultaneous discovery. So I believe in the DNA molecule, multiple people discovered it right around the same time. I've heard anecdotally, maybe apocryphally, that the pyramids in the Americas and in Egypt arose at somewhat of a surprisingly similar time, that there's examples throughout history of ideas or concepts that were stumbled upon or discovered or developed around the same time. And of course, there's other explanations for this. It could just be pure coincidence. It could be that people are studying the same materials, reading the same papers, going over the same experiments, and that they just kind of chanced upon it around the same time. And, of course, that's possible. Another idea is that our mind and our thoughts are really more like a sea that we all surf in. You could think of it almost maybe like a radio frequency that's available in the public atmosphere that our brains are all receiving. And that the reason you have some of these discoveries around the same time is that the swells, the potential for that particular wave, right, the double helix DNA molecule, the pyramid structure, arrive as these swells, right? And you have brains that are similarly structured in different places, perhaps even on different continents. But because these swells arise from a common place and are commonly experienceable, they can break almost simultaneously across those different brains, and those same people can have that epiphany, that aha, that light bulb go off. They can essentially surf the same wave around the same time, because again, the thought was never something private to their mind to begin with. Or, to even say their mind was not a real thing. The mind is shared, the thoughts are shared, and it's really just the way the thoughts break over the bottom, right, the individual brain, that determines when and how the person experiences the idea. So that was one thing, this concept of simultaneous discovery. The other is kind of on and off days, right? What surfers know is even if you've got a good spot, right, a good sandbar, a good reef, a good point break, it's not always going to break well. There are going to be some days where the swells just aren't right, or they're going in the wrong direction, right? The swells may really be moving more this way, right, or this way. So they don't really get in here, right, to hit over the bottom to form the wave. Or within a certain day, right, there's other conditions at play here, the wind direction and the wind intensity, the tide, right, high tide or low tide can wash things out or suck things out. And so I guess what I'm saying here is when we have on-off days or on or off moments throughout the day, if we're kind of using this metaphor, you could just recognize, hey, my brain, which is kind of like a sandbar or a reef or a point that receives the swells of thought in the sea of mind, maybe the conditions just aren't right. And I think especially if we're a type A personality, or especially if we're kind of caught up in a competitive environment, a fast-paced environment, we want to kind of pound our brains to always be on and to always be working with the same quality. If instead, though, we were to take more of the surfer's mentality and respect the nature of the conditions, and respect that to some degree these conditions are really external to us and beyond our control, we could be more at peace with those periods when our mind is kind of flat and there's nothing really coming up. We can use that as an opportunity to wax our board, or go play golf, or take a nap, do something else. And then we go back and we surf when the conditions are right, when we can sense that mind and thought and bottom are working in harmony to produce rideable conditions. Okay, so a third one, this is kind of similar to the first one, but is mind reading and mind melding, right? So I think we've all had this experience where you're with somebody, maybe a loved one, maybe a stranger, and you notice that you're kind of maybe having the same thought at the same time. Maybe you're finishing each other's sentences. You have that jinx experience where it's like you say the same word in the same moment. And again, could just be a coincidence. Could just be that, minds are habituated in similar ways, and so they just kind of spit out the same output in the same way. But if we use this ocean metaphor, we can see that these two individuals maybe are really in the same sea, right? And these swells are moving through that sea, right, in one direction or the other, and they're breaking across the reef or the sandbar of the mind, right, and pitching waves. And so if those bottoms are similar, or if the swell is just powerful enough or strong enough that even if these bottoms are different, it still manages to produce surfable waves in both, you can have that simultaneously wave breaking experience. And then if the individuals express it, that's when you may discover, wow, there's a similarity there. And it kind of makes you think, for all the times we have where you have that mind melding, right, you have that same thought expressed at the same time, how often is that actually happening in the mind where you have a match? But because one individual doesn't express it or the other doesn't, you never actually know. And so that, I think, because we may be thinking, wow, if this is true, or if this is kind of hinting or pointing toward the truth of how mind and thought and brain work, shouldn't we be having those experiences more often? And I think the reality is we likely are, but because we're not always sharing ideas aloud, or sometimes even recognizing maybe some of the ideas that are in our minds at the moment, we may not realize how common that is. Okay, so another one I want to talk about is why certain people tend to consistently have interesting, captivating, helpful ideas, right? So like an author who just churns out story after story, book after book, an artist who produces, like a Picasso, just painting after painting after painting, and then even just more in day-to-day life, people who consistently have good ideas around something like cooking or parenting or exercise or something like that. Why do some people seem to be consistently surfing quality waves of a certain type and others don't? And I think we tend to think, oh, well, this person's just more talented, they're better, they're superior, something like that. And I think what this notion invites us to see is to kind of destigmatize it a little bit and see it instead as just a physical property of the brain itself, that their brain, right, either through genetic conditioning or through upbringing or through deliberate training or perhaps some combination of those three or other factors, their brain has developed a certain shape where it just consistently, right, receives certain types of swells in a way and can cause them to break, right? And just like Picasso, if he may have a swell, a thought of a beautiful medical device come across his head, but either that's not his reef, right, or his sandbar, his brain isn't really shaped to make that medical idea turn into a surfable wave, or he's just not that kind of surfer, right? He may be having those ideas, but he's looking to surf painting waves, right? Art waves. And so he lets those medical ideas kind of come by, doesn't really even pay much attention to them. His eye is on the horizon for the surfable waves. And so, anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting idea too. Another idea here is catching versus surfing, right? So when someone's surfing, right, we'll draw a coastline here. We'll have the waves coming in here, the swells coming in. And then we'll have the waves breaking right here. And then we've got our surfer down here on the shore. Right, standing with the board, ready to go out and ride. Now, of course, you can't surf from the sand, or you've got to get out into the water, and typically what that means is you've got to paddle out. And a lot of times you've got to paddle out through the waves to get there. Meaning you're going, waves are crashing over your head, you're either kind of pushing through the foam or diving under the wave, coming out until you can get out into that zone where the wave is breaking, right? And that's when you're positioned to actually then turn around, paddle, right? Match the wave's energy and then stand up and ride it. And so I think this kind of reflects an experience a lot of us have, I know I do, where I can kind of do my routine thoughts, my kind of day-to-day habit things without really having to paddle out. But when I want to really get into, a deeper piece of writing, or I want to come up with a plan for the future that maybe has multiple variables, right? Plan a vacation, planning a business idea, whatever it is, it's not always easy to just snap right into that mode. I think what we have to do sometimes is we have to paddle out into our mental sweet spot and get to the point where the waves of that type are breaking in our mind. And so, anyway, if you've ever had that experience trying to kind of get into the zone, trying to get into the thinking mode, you may think of that as, hey, I'm kind of paddling out into my surf spot, and then I'm going to kind of bob in the water and wait for my wave to come. Instead of this thought of, okay, it's in my brain, like the idea is already in there and I need to like pull it out or rip it out, or I need to kind of ramp or wind my brain up to get it to spark these ideas. Just think of it as more as, hey, I'm a surfer, I'm on the shore right now, and it's going to take a little time and a little effort and a little patience to get out into that sweet spot. But when I do, I know that generally that's going to be the best opportunity I have to potentially catch some waves and surf. Another thought here on this, dichotomy of catching the wave versus surfing the wave is there's a difference between having a thought and being able to translate the thought into a form that's useful or beneficial either to the individual or to others. And this can be one of the more frustrating parts of the creative process or the thinking process, right? Which is, you can get out there, right? You can be in the water. You can see the wave forming, right? It's getting ready to pitch. It's hitting that bottom. It's kind of rising up. And you're turning, right? You're on your wave. You're on your belly. And you're paddling to catch it. Now, I think catching the wave is kind of like the experience of having the thought, right? The thought kind of coming to you or occurring to you, passing through your mental field, right? You're experiencing it, right? Its energy is matching yours. But as a lot of surfers know, there's a huge difference between being out in the water, turning and catching the wave, and then making the next move, which is then standing up, balancing on the board, right, that's moving through and with the wave, and being able to ride it, right, especially as the wave then crashes and breaks down behind you, right, and kind of is bearing down on you. There's some time pressure involved. There may be some mental pressure involved. There's a whole lot of spatial factors your body's trying to keep track of here. You're thinking about not hitting the bottom. There may be other surfers in the lineup that you're trying to avoid. You're trying to pick your angle, your speed, your technique you're going to use. And so what this brings to mind for me is just that difference between having the thought and being able to translate the thought either into a spoken expression or a written expression, for someone like a writer or a speaker, or someone like an artist being able to turn it into a sculpture or into a painting, or even just as simple as something for, a parent, right, or a friend, being able to then take action in accordance with that thought, right, in a way that serves another person or serves the individual. And so I would just say, if you're finding yourself stuck in this mode, right, catching and having difficulty surfing, it may just indicate that there's more training required in that area. It may indicate that these conditions aren't really the right conditions for you at your skill level right now. We may be trying to catch waves that are too big or too fast or too difficult. And so it may be helpful to kind of start with some simpler, smaller ones, kind of get our footing and build our skill level up. Okay, one here, this one will be pretty quick, but it was just a quote I remember hearing from John Kabat-Zinn, that you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Right? He said you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Right? And so if we map that onto our metaphor here, right? The mind is the sea, these swells are the thoughts, right? The brain is the bottom, right? And the interplay of that sea, those swells, and that brain is what produces the crashing wave, which is the experience of thinking a thought or having a thought occur in the mind. And so using his quote, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. If you're finding yourself in the mind, right, and you're kind of bobbing out there over the, with your legs dangling over the sandbar, the reef that is your brain, and these swells keep coming, if you don't know how to surf, you may just be getting inundated again and again and again. They'll just keep crashing on you. And you may feel victimized by them. You may feel overwhelmed by them. And so I think if we see, though, the arrivals of these thoughts as invitations to surf, then we can turn the experience of thinking into something that's more like a dance, something that's more cooperative or collaborative. And we could begin to take more choice and ownership over the thinking process. And this kind of goes into another one I was going to talk about. I'll just bring it up now, which is picking your waves, right? What surfers learn pretty quickly is when you go out, if you want to have a certain experience, you really sometimes got to wait for the conditions to be just right. You kind of wait for your wave, right? Different swells will come in, but they may be too big for you or too small for you, right? It may be breaking too fast. It may be barreling when you want to crumble, or vice versa. And so what good surfers learn to do is they learn to kind of study the horizon. They learn how the swells are coming in, how they're breaking. They kind of get a feel for the conditions, and then using their long-term experience and knowledge, right, their long-term pattern recognition, which is kind of their surfing intuition, combined with their immediate awareness, right, of what the waves are like on that particular day, they learn, sometimes seeing the swell out hundreds of yards from shore, they can begin to see, okay, that's one that I'm going to consider going for, that's one I'm definitely going for, that's one I'm not going for. And we can start to do the same thing with thoughts, right? Sometimes it feels like thoughts won't stop coming, or we're having the same recurring thought over and over again. And if instead of thinking of it as something that's like sprouting or bubbling or rattling around inside our private heads, if we think of it instead as swells that are rolling through everybody, right? Rolling through our entire species, rolling through our entire planet, we don't have to take them so personally. And we can just let them go by. We could say, that's not what I'm here to surf right now. I'm here to surf a different wave. I'm looking for a different experience. I don't want to get caught up in that. Because there is something of a zero-sum game to this, right? When I'm surfing one wave, I can't be surfing another. And so if I'm getting caught surfing a wave that's on a guilt story or just reliving the past, and wow, there's a new creative or inspired idea that comes, if all I'm doing is just surfing those old, tired, familiar waves, I don't really free myself to explore and go to the new ones. And so this gives us some empowerment to exercise discretion, to use our judgment, to train and trust our recognition, and then just to see those thoughts as forces, acts of nature, right? Forces of the universe just sweeping through, and then we as the surfer make the choice. Do I turn and paddle and try to catch it? Or do I let the energy just pass through me, right? A surfer will just feel the wave kind of go, and the surfer, like a buoy, will rise and then fall, right? And just let it happen, and we're keeping our eyes on the horizon for the waves that we really want. And, you know, one other thing I'll talk about here, this is the last one on my list, is the notion of self, or the notion of what we are, or what I am in this experience. And, you know, so far I've been saying, well, what we are essentially is kind of the surfer, or maybe what we are is also kind of the act of surfing, right? The unfolding of the surfing process in time, right? So we could say, that's me, that's me, that's me, or we could say, this is me. And I think that's helpful. I think it's certainly better than identifying just as the wave, the swell, or the sea, or the bottom, because really what we are, especially when we're at our, let's say, our best or our most fulfilled, is when we're actually having dynamic, interactive experiences with our environment and our world in a way that inspires us. And so the surfer and the surfing notion of that is helpful. But I think we can also flex it. And we could say, you know, not only are we the surfer, we're also to some degree the sun in the sky, right? Shining down on the whole experience. This may be something akin to our awareness, right? Or our spirit, or our soul, which isn't necessarily as caught up in the experience of the wave. It's really more about a global, holistic awareness of the dynamics of the whole process, right? In fact, if you've been watching this and kind of going along with it and studying the interplay of these things, I think what you've been using is your kind of spirit or soul awareness, which is kind of, again, like the sun shining down on this image here. You can imagine you're something like a bird, right, coasting above the waterline there, maybe a few feet above, maybe a couple 100 feet above it. And I think inevitably we're always going to kind of come back and circle back to this concept that we're the surfer, and that may be primary, but if we can flex our self-conception and our self-notion out into these other things, and sometimes get out of our conception that we're just this, it really can expand our horizons. It can really break some of our habitual tendencies, our stiffness, our small-mindedness, and let us get out into a more exciting and kind of broader horizon way of looking at things. Okay, I think that's all I have for that one.